So, as Paul McCartney might say, here's one more silly video on the hard problem of consciousness and what's wrong with that. And this one's inspired by a conversation I had just recently with a very famous neuroanatomist, and she was so passionate about this idea that the brain will tell us who we are, that the brain will reveal the nature of everything, every bit of who we are. So when we sit back and we ask the question, who am I? We don't have to look any further than the brain. And it's just a matter of time. And so, and it wasn't until much later after the conversation it occurred to me, well, what brain are you talking about? And when I say that we have two brains, I don't mean the left and right side. What I'm getting at here is, again, taking this back to the thinking mind and the limitations of the thinking mind, which as a species we are really just stumbling on. I mean, we know the limitations of our perceptions. People know that the eye is a filter and it only perceives a very small fraction of the light energy out there. But this idea that our ideas, that the thinking process itself has those same types of limitations is something that our species is just starting to recognize. So one of my favorite quotes, I think it was an engineer, so I'm drawing a blank on the name, but so let's take this slowly. If the brain were simple enough to be understood, we would be too simple to understand it. Now, that's a nice little paradox, because it really shows how, I mean, even from a neuroscience perspective, that our thoughts and the thinking mind kind of sits on top of this massively parallel processor. So the thinking mind, which does one thing at a time, one thought at a time, it simply can't understand all that's going on. And if the brain were simple enough, if it didn't have these parallel systems, if it were simple enough to be understood, then we simply would be too simple to understand it. So sorry for that little adventure. But to get back to this, so the hard problem is this idea that the brain is it. That when we ask the question of who we are, what is consciousness, we will find the answers somehow in the brain. And what I'm bringing up is, which brain do you mean? The brain as it actually exists. It's almost a hypothetical, and philosophers have talked about the world as it is and reality as it is, and then our perceptions and our thoughts about it. So when I say which brain, what I mean is, which brain are you talking about? The brain as it exists in reality, and reality is messy and wiggly, and there's no real definitive place where this brain ends and the rest of the universe begins. Or the other brain, the thinking mind's conception of the brain. And that's what neuroscience does. It uses the thinking mind to divide and categorize and create abstractions about this other brain. And the fascinating thing about abstractions, which I discuss so much in my videos, they don't even exist outside the mind's construct of them. So when we talk about the hard problem of consciousness, I think we have to, we have to get around thinking. We have to recognize the limitations of the thought process itself. And so when we get to the hard problem, are we actually saying that the thinking mind will one day have the capacity to understand the brain? Because that seems pretty far-fetched, because of the limitations of the thinking mind can only think of one thing at a time, and those thoughts themselves are just abstractions, categories that it creates that are not even part of this other reality, which is always a mystery. So in my view, that seems like a paradox that I don't think has been discussed too much. It's not, I mean, the hard problem, again, is a hard problem it's an impossible problem for the thinking mind. The thinking mind, with its limitations of one thought at a time, suddenly has this problem thrown onto it of trying to conceptualize massive parallel processing, which of course is much more a reflection of nature And even when I say massive parallel processing, that's all interconnected with everything. Even that is simply words that the thinking mind is using to try to give its best pointer to what reality actually is.